Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Special Education News and Noteworthy, the podcast where we break down the news and noteworthy things happening in special education throughout the U.S. and talk about what they mean for students, families, educators, and advocates. Before we get started, if you're enjoying the podcast, we'd love for you to take a moment to follow the show on Spotify. Following the podcast helps more families find us and ensures you never miss an episode.
That's right. And this week we're talking about access to accommodations, specialized school placements, autism program availability, special education funding, and the growing conversation around assistive technology in schools. Let's jump right in.
Our first story comes from Disability Scoop and focuses on who is accessing disability accommodations in schools. A new study found that students from wealthier families are nearly twice as likely to receive accommodations through Section 504 plan compared to students from lower income families. At the same time, students from lower income families were much more likely to receive services through an Individualized Education Program, or IEP. Researchers suggest that access to private evaluations, educational consultants, advocacy support, and a family's ability to navigate school systems may all play a role in these disparities. The study raises important questions about equity and whether all students who need accommodations are being identified and supported, regardless of their family's financial resources.
This finding did not surprise me, and I think you would be in agreement, Paige.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think it's one of those things where if you look at the news story, the researchers are saying there needs to be more research done, right? Because they're like, it would make sense, they were saying, for in lower income situations of, maybe parents just not having that accessibility in terms of schools have a legal obligation through IDEA for child find, right? To identify students with disabilities who may need an IEP. It's not the same thing for 504 plans. There is no child find type of thing. So you're not getting a school reaching out to you in most cases about maybe your child needs a 504 plan. They're not, schools aren't getting those funds to go towards special education that they're getting under the IDEA. So I think that's a big part of it because in
Totally.
most cases, students are being identified for that, and they're being told, okay, hey, we're going to evaluate your child if you give us permission to. They're going to qualify for XYZ, and it's very much led by the school, whereas sometimes Section 504, so for 504 plans, that is often very parent driven,
Yes.
and there isn't really any parent education being given around, okay, what is the difference between IEP and a 504? If my kid's not qualifying for an IEP, what can they get? And sometimes those are
Mhm.
accommodations under a 504 plan. So I think, and they were saying in there, that's part of it. These parents having, more resources, more time, sometimes more connections to push for 504s. And then there's the other hand of where, because there's such a big gap, is it being abused a little bit in high schools or middle schools where that testing is a thing and parents want to give their kid a leg up?
Sure. I think, you said something about when a child does not qualify for special education services and then, trying to get a 504 after that and saying, well, my child is still struggling. What else can I do to support them? And some accommodations can support children at that point in time. But I feel like it doesn't surprise me. I think about my experience teaching in inner city where, very, very few kiddos were on a 504, very like minimal. And I feel like to the kids that did go the 504 route, if they did not qualify for special education services, was because their families either had access to an advocate or an educational consultant. Some of the families, just by for medical reasons, had access to private neuropsychological evaluations, so they were able to, use that data and the personnel, the advocates, to come to the table to, to push and to support the parents to making, those decisions. But it's people that have the means, and we're seeing an increase in wealthier areas because, a lot of these parents do have the means to get outside evaluations conducted, and they do have access to educational consultants and advocates to support their families for better or for worse. And I think that, you know, I agree. A lot of research does need to be done in this area because I there are so many kids from that school that I'm thinking of that should have had access to the 504 that didn't, and I think it all comes down to, like, the financial strains, and it's not fair, so
Yeah, and what does it mean for parents? It means knowing that an IEP isn't the only thing out there. If your child doesn't
right,
necessarily need the supports given in an IEP, like modified instruction, then there are things like extended test time, flexible seating, things that can be put into a 504 plan that might support your child.
right,
That if because sometimes when they graduate from an IEP, which some children do, and which is a great thing for them, if they're not going into a 504 plan sometime, then it can be a little bit flailing, right? Because all of a sudden all those supports are gone. So that's also a really nice transition for kiddos that no longer need special education services, but still need some accommodation. So it's just knowing what your options are as well.
yeah, it's not, like, the biggest barrier is not the disability itself, it's about knowing how to navigate the system and understanding that there are other opportunities other than an individualized education plan for your child. So, next story is coming from Chalkbeat, Colorado, and it examines concerns surrounding a specialized school serving students with significant behavioral and disability related needs. The Austin Centers for Exceptional Students, known as ACEs, is facing increased oversight and state sanctions after concerns were raised about the use of physical restraints and behavior intervention practices. According to that reporting, several families and advocates allege that students experience restraints, frequent restraints, and injuries while attending the school. Colorado education officials have since implemented a corrective action plan and launched a broader review of the program. The school has stated that it serves students with significant behavioral needs and that restraint is only used when necessary to prevent harm. It also says it has taken the steps to improve training, documentation, and oversight. The story highlights the challenges that schools face when supporting students with intensive needs while also ensuring the students' safety, dignity, and their rights remain protected.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, I used to work I got my training in working with, special needs populations in a residential treatment center for children who had a diagnosis of emotional disability, and we were trained in how to do restraints, and I worked there for probably about 2 years. I only did 3 restraints during my entire time there because it really was something where they invested heavily in training of behavior intervention and de-escalation techniques, and they would celebrate when we would have a very low months for restraint. So for them, it would be really the
last
last
resort.
ditch effort. Yeah, the last
Yeah,
resort.
yeah,
But there are plenty of institutions, unfortunately, that it is not the last resort, even though, of course, all the stuff is going to say that this is the last resort. If staff don't have that training where they feel secure enough in how to de escalate a situation, unfortunately, they are going to think that that was the last resort. But they really were not using all the tools in their toolkit. Because when de
sure.
escalation is used successfully, it should be a lot less restraints going on, and it's something that it's traumatic. It's extremely traumatic for the child being restrained. I remember, having to do restraints, and I felt like it was traumatic. I can still, think back
Oh,
to those, and it's a terrible moment
yeah.
in a child's life to have to be to being restrained, not even having to be restrained, but being restrained. So I think restraints in schools, a lot of people are pushing to stop them because really there should be better de-escalation techniques. And unfortunately, we see a lot of institutions that, although they say they use them as the last resort, they rely on them heavily. I mean, we've seen this past year a parent that we knew, where it was clear that it was not being used as a last resort at all, even though they were saying it. It just wasn't matching up, and
The
yeah,
documentation wasn't accurate, the
yeah,
parents weren't informed in the proper
it's
way,
dangerous.
there's so much to it.
Yeah, it's dangerous for the children, it's traumatic for the children, and when you're given the out of a restraint being an option, unfortunately, it does lead to restraint sometimes being used when it really wasn't the last resort.
Yeah, yeah, I agree, I have done it probably on one hand at a local school that I was working at one point, and, I mean, the training alone was so significant, and you knew when you were restraint trained. I think it was, I want to say it was like 2 or 3 days of like intensive training because there was like a procedure and the right way of doing it, and you can't do this way. You got to do this way. Like there's certain holes that you have to use, and thinking about this particular district, like, in a school where there's significant needs like this, like how many people were actually restraint trained? It's very expensive to be trained,
Mhm.
in these certain holds. Were the people that were actually doing these restraints, were they certified? Did they go through and call a meeting to conduct a functional behavior analysis and put a behavior plan into place? Like you said, exhausting all the options. So there's still, I feel like there's a lot of information that we don't know from this story. uh, but it should be, and hopefully will always be, the last resort that schools use, and the primary goal is to keep that child and others safe, but, hopefully that's the last resort moving forward.
Absolutely. So, our third story comes from West Virginia, where lawmakers are taking a closer look at how special education is funded across different educational settings. House Education Committee Chairman Joe Statler is seeking more information about how students with disabilities are being served in public schools, charter schools, private schools, and homeschooling environments. The discussion comes as education officials report a growing gap between the cost of providing special education services and the funding available to support them. Officials estimate that gap is approximately $180 million statewide. Lawmakers say they want a better understanding of where students are being served, how services are funded, and whether current systems are meeting student needs. As more families explore different educational options, these are conversations we're likely going to see happening in more states across the country.
Hmm. I mean, schools obviously are facing super difficult decisions when funding falls short. But what needs to really be clear here is that students' rights don't disappear because budgets are tight. And I feel like parents, a lot of times parents hire advocates because that's their angle, is that, my child's needs are not being met. And they're not being met because they're saying that the school cannot provide services for my child, and because of budget constraints. And we hear this over and over again. And it's not an excuse. Their kids' needs need to be met no matter what the funding situation is, and I think we need to be a little bit more creative and figure out how we can best support these students when budget systems are tight, and better use our staff and support teams appropriately in the schools. How
Well,
to
this
how to and also how to maintain them. I think that's a big issue in special education right now, is that there's such a dip in special education teachers, and they're burnt out. Like, how can we better support them so that they stay and that they're retained, so that we can provide the best services for these kids and not have to rehire, people on different steps of the ladder, over time.
Well, this article was also really interesting because a lot of his focus was on charter schools and charter school
Yep,
fundings because even though charter schools have their own board, which they're run by, they are still pulling public school funds
yep.
and really trying to see, okay, like what is this going into? I believe it was last week we did a story about finally they're going to be the federal level is going to be taking a deeper look into, okay, yes, we know how what states get how much amount of money, but now what is that being spent on? So it sounds like it's kind of happening at a state level here, and which it
Mhm.
should, right? We want the money to be going to the areas of need for special education to make it as efficient and effective as possible, and that we're funding the right areas that need to be funded. And it's very interesting with charter schools too, because they do to some extent get to operate by a different playbook
Mhm.
than general public schools. So
They
yeah,
also talked about homeschool situations, homeschool that whose children were homeschooled who also receive services from the district, and how that looks. So it wasn't just charter, it was homeschool, and I am blanking, maybe Catholic school too, right? And how, like, private schools where the services from the state are also being delegated into those types of programs. So yeah, it's a lot to think about, but you know, I don't know.
yeah, I think like I said, I think that state level this should be happening all the time because it is a big breadth of things that they have to keep track of, right? And unfortunately there are always bad characters in any situation, any scenario where money is involved that you do want to make sure that all the funds are being used for what they're supposed to be used for. All
Yeah.
right, what do you have up next?
Okay, our fourth story takes us to New York City, where families recently had the opportunity to question school leaders directly about special education services. During a Community Education Council town hall, a student enrolled in one of the city's autism programs asked Chancellor Kamar Samuels what the district is doing to try to reduce wait lists for specialized autism programs like Horizon, Nest, and Ames. District leaders acknowledged that demand continues to exceed capacity and announced plans to expand autism programming in the coming year. Families also raised concerns about transportation, including the long bus rides and the delays that impact students' ability to access their education. The conversation from this Queen's Chronicle highlights a really important reality for many families, that having a program available is one thing, but ensuring students can actually access it in a reasonable and meaningful way is another challenge altogether.
We just had this conversation with a parent a couple weeks ago
Yeah,
about, I think it was the difference between Horizon and Nest programs, and then, I mean, even to get them on the phone had been a really tough thing for that parent to do, and then to get an answer from a follow-up was another tough thing to do. I mean, all over in New York City right now, there's that mandate for smaller class sizes. I believe that that's been pushed back. I'm not sure for how long, probably a year or two, just because there's space problem, there's staffing problem, and there are just so many people living in small areas that it's a problem all over for even just a gen ed classroom and a gen ed school accessibility. So for these programs that really are built to be a certain size, now having to expand it because there is an increase in autism identification and students needing those supports, and they're great programs. When I was doing my master's, we learned extensively about the Nest program and Horizon, and there really are great programs for students. So I understand why there is such a push for children to be in them, because they are great. But yeah, clearly it says that they're going to expand it in the next year or so. Great. I'm sure there will still be wait lists, but hopefully it can do a little bit of push in there to make it less of a wait list. And then
yeah.
busing. Busing's been a
Yeah,
mess.
the busing, the transportation really matters. I recall a family that we were working with this past year at Paige that really was like, "That program sounds ideal. However, it cannot be 45-minute commute. My child is 1st grade and, on the autism spectrum, and I know that when she gets to school, those long bus rides are going to create anxiety for her. She's gonna arrive dysregulated, and she's not gonna wanna go to school. There might be some school avoidance." So, I know that that transportation piece really plays a part. So, that's something that they really have to consider moving forward. Yeah, but it all goes back to, equity and making sure that, kids can access it immediately, but it also is appropriate so that a child can, it can be like within a neighborhood school or like at least locally, that they don't have to be on a bus for an hour at a it's tricky.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember being, a District 75 teacher and, hearing a little bit about busing. Busing is a tricky thing because what classrooms are available, like they were saying,
Yeah,
like what programs are available, what are going to be closest to where their neighborhood school would be, and then, just because you might be a 20-minute straight drive doesn't necessarily mean on a bus that it's gonna be 20 minutes. It can be an hour more. So I just always remember that it was just
far
like
from that.
yeah, it was always just really like puzzle pieces just constantly moving around to really try to figure out busing for students, so it's complicated. But yeah, parents should absolutely be aware of that they can ask questions, they can, push a little bit, right? If the busing sometimes you can have busing limits on a child's IEP that this child can be on a bus for no more than X amount of time, if your child cannot
Right.
be seated for that long. So there are things, right?
Yeah.
Maybe your child needs medication. Maybe they need something that they have to have a limit of busing time in their IEP. But that's a thing that if it's needed and appropriate for them, then it can be added.
Yep.
All right. So our final story this week comes from NPR and focuses on the growing movement to reduce screen use in schools. Across the country, state and school districts are adopting policies that limit or restrict student access to phones, tablets, and other technology during the school day. While many of these efforts are aimed at reducing distractions and improving student engagement, disability advocates are raising concerns about unintended consequences. The article highlights the story of a student with dyslexia whose academic success dramatically improved after gaining access to assistive technology, including audiobooks and digital note taking tools. Advocates point out that for many students with disability, Technology isn't simply a convenience, it's an accommodation that helps them access their education. As schools continue to rethink technology use, this story serves as an important reminder that accessibility needs must remain part of the conversation. And I think it's very common in today's day and age, especially in the fact that many of us just read the headlines, right? And we feel like our opinions have to be black and white. It's really important to remember that there are always going to be in between and shades of gray. And yeah, there has been a big push to limit tech in the classroom because there has been way too much of a push for tech in the classroom. I mean, school districts are being incentivized by all these tech companies to have tech, tech, tech. And now parents are finally pushing back against it. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to swing the pendulum in the completely opposite direction because
Right.
there are students for whom assistive technology is vitally necessary for them to make meaningful gains. So it's just about just remembering that like it's not either or, right? There can still be appropriate uses for those kiddos that still need assistive tech.
Right, and they said it so perfectly in this article. They're like, "Technology is not a convenience, it's but for these particular kids, it's how they access the curriculum." And, that's not a black or white issue. That's you can these kids need to ensure that they're receiving accommodations even when the technology is restricted and implemented, because if not, they're not there are kids that, use assistive technology to communicate, and if those things are taken away from them, they're not able to participate with their peers or with their teachers because that's being taken from them. So,
Well, and if
it
they're
becomes
talking
like a
about
bigger.
assistive tech, I'm sure they're not talking about like the AAC devices or anything like that. But yeah, like having their computers in front of them to do like the speech to text for the writing and
Well,
stuff.
speech
Like,
is that, yeah, yeah. I mean, who knows? I mean, yeah, you could be right there, but I was thinking on a larger scale that they should not. How do you determine that this child can receive assistive technology, whereas somebody else is not going to be able to access the same types of accommodations, and it's just not fair across the board.
yeah,
I know that we have done, some observations over the years, and the rule in many of the classrooms were no computer use at all, unless you had a certain accommodation that you need to do note taking. I mean, like I think 90% of the kids in the class had their computers open, and that's where I think that people can really it's difficult to figure out like what kids are actually receiving accommodations, one what kids are not, and I think it was an article, this particular article or another one that I read said, specifically within the middle and high school years, how difficult it is to keep and monitor which kids are actually receiving assistive technology and use of computers, keeping track of those things when you're constantly on like a rotating schedule. But guess what? Those things need to be, monitored, and you have to know which children receive certain accommodations in the class, because you're giving the other kiddos a leg up, whereas for the kids that actually need it, you're actually just leveling the playing field. So I feel very
yeah,
strongly about that.
yeah. And I would assume and hope that you know, for any kid that would possibly be a candidate for assistive tech, that schools would just do what they are supposed to do, which is an assistive tech evaluation. And so they would see what level of support is appropriate. And sometimes assistive tech is like a modified pencil, right? Like sometimes it's not even
Right.
technology when we're talking about that. But it's important to have those options available that are actual technology of like computers or recording devices still available to kiddos. And, hopefully that goes well as they're rolling back some of these allowances of tech being in the classroom. Hopefully they'll still do right by our differently abled kiddos.
All right. Well, those are this week's top stories in special education.
If you'd like to dive deeper into this week's topics, be sure to check out the full newsletter, which is available in our show notes. This week's Special Education Insight is going to explore the difference between access and availability, and why having services on paper doesn't always mean students can easily access the support they need.
We've also included a couple of picks of the week, including the Molly and Tanjo Memorial Foundation and our upcoming From Parent to Advocate parent training program, which is incredible, which begins June 22nd.
Yep. And before you go, if you're finding these conversations helpful, please take a moment to follow the podcast on Spotify. Rate us 5 stars if you feel so moved. Following the show helps us reach more families, educators, and advocates, and ensures you'll be notified when new episodes are released.
Thank you for spending part of your week with us. And until next time, stay hopeful, stay vocal, and take care of yourself.
Bye, everyone.